Hello, in this video I'll go through a few problems from practice problem set 2-2. In this practice problem set we are adding unstated premises to arguments. In chapter 1 we considered arguments with unstated conclusions. Now we're considering arguments with unstated premises. An unstated premise is some sort of a connection that the arguer has in mind or intends between the stated premise or premises on the one hand, and on the other hand, the conclusion. So again, we're not just making something up here. Our job when we're adding unstated premises is not one of creating something, it's rather one of interpreting what the arguer intends as the unstated connection between the premise or premises that were stated and the conclusion. How we go about that depends on whether the argument in question is deductive or inductive. By definition, a deductive argument with an unstated premise is valid. That means assuming the premises are all true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. By contrast, an inductive argument with an unstated premise is, by definition, strong. That means, assuming the premises are true, it is very unlikely that the conclusion is false. The relevant difference there is in the case of validity, the concept of impossibility, versus in the case of strength, the concept of something being very unlikely. Let me show you how this will go. I'm going to start with number 1, which says Damien had a mohawk, so obviously he liked them. First, we need to get clear about what the stated parts of these arguments are, and I'm focusing in on the word so. That's a conclusion introducers, which is telling me the conclusion is at the end, and the stated premise is earlier, namely Damien had a mohawk. So let me start by writing the stated premise on the board. I'm going to leave some blank space that we can fill in with an unstated premise and drop down to the conclusion that he liked them. That is, Damien liked mohawks. Now, the connection that's been left unstated here by the arguer is a connection between the predicate concepts of the stated premise and the conclusion. That is, the connection that's left unstated is the connection between having a mohawk on the one hand and liking them on the other hand. Let's first consider this as an example of a deductive argument and add the unstated premise, which makes that connection explicit, in such a way that we make the argument valid. Now, how I'm doing this is influenced by the fact that the stated premise and the conclusion have the same subject and are both affirmative. They're both saying something is true rather than saying that something is not true. In that kind of a situation, to make the argument valid, we can add an unstated premise that starts with the word every or everyone or everybody if it's about people, or with the word all. How about this? Everybody who has a mohawk likes them. Now you see if 1 and 2 are true, there's no way in the world that 3 could be false, so we're looking at a valid argument. All right, I want to stick with the same argument, at least with the same stated parts, and consider the argument as inductive rather than deductive, which means that we're going to have to change the unstated premise in such a way that instead of the argument being valid, it's strong. Strong again means, assuming the premises are true, it's very unlikely for the conclusion to be false. Well, words like every and all do not allow for any possibility of exception. And in stating an unstated premise in an inductive argument, we do need to allow for a possibility of exception. So instead of everybody, let's start this sentence with most people. Now we're going to have to, for the sake of grammar, make a couple little changes later. Most people who have a mohawk like them. Now I hope you can see, assuming 1 and 2 are true, it's very unlikely that 3 is false. So we're looking at a strong argument. So this would be an accurate interpretation of the arguer's unstated premise, taking this argument to be inductive. Let me go down to number 5 now, in which basketball coach Dean Smith wrote the following. Some coaches say revenge is not an effective motivating factor because the emotion is short-lived. Coach Smith uses the premise introducer because, so that tells us that the stated premise in this argument is the emotion, meaning the emotion of revenge, is short-lived. Let's start with that. What's the stated conclusion here? Well, now we've got to be a little careful. We have to consider whose argument is being presented. The author, Dean Smith, is not giving his own argument here. No, instead he's telling his readers about an argument that some coaches give. So the phrase "some coaches say" is not part of the conclusion. The conclusion is simply, revenge is not an effective motivating factor. The unstated connection that we'll have to add in the unstated premise is, of course, a connection between an emotion being short-lived on the one hand and an emotion not being an effective motivating factor on the other hand. Both 1 and 3 have the same subject, but unlike number 1, problem number 1 that we looked at in this practice problem set, the stated premise and the conclusion are not both affirmative. The stated premise is affirmative, but notice the word "not" here in the conclusion. The word "not" is indicating negation, and that determines that we have to take a different approach to specifying the unstated premise. Taking this as an example of a deductive argument, we cannot start with the word "all" or the word "every." We have to start with "no," or if we were talking about people, we might say "no one" or "nobody." How about this then? No emotion that is short-lived is an effective motivating factor. Now, if 1 and 2 are true, 3 must also be true, and that tells us that 2 is a correct interpretation of the arguer's intended unstated premise, assuming this argument to be deductive. Let's stick with the same argument, at least in terms of its stated parts, and consider it as an example of an inductive argument. That means we're going to have to change the unstated premise just a little bit. I mean, it's not like an extreme change, but we have to change it a little bit. So instead of making it impossible for the conclusion to be false, it simply makes it unlikely for the conclusion to be false. And an easy way to do that is, instead of starting with "no," start with "most" and then use the word "not" later on in the sentence. So what we could say is that most emotions that are short-lived are not an effective motivating factor. Now, if 1 and 2 are true, it would be possible for 3 to be false, but it's very unlikely. And that tells us that 2, the way we have it now, is a correct interpretation of the unstated premise of these arguers, assuming that the argument is inductive. Let me warn you about something here, a particular kind of construction not to use. Sometimes you'll see English sentences Sometimes you'll see English sentences with it's kind of a structure. Every A is not B, or all A are not B. Do not use those constructions in this class. They are ambiguous. They might mean no A is B, or they might mean not all A are B. And this ambiguity is one that affects validity and strength. If this is the intended connection, well, then yes, that when we're adding that as an unstated premise, we'd have a valid argument. But we wouldn't if this was what it means, and we wouldn't even have a strong argument if not all A or B is what the sentence means. So again, just completely stay away from constructions like every A is not B or all A are not B. Looking at how long this video has been going on, I'm only going to do one more with you, and that will be number 6. This is a quote from Buster Keaton, who was a comedic actor. He was best known for physical comedy, very outrageous physical comedy in silent films during the 1920s. And he said, "I never used a stuntman because stuntmen don't get laughs." All right, he uses because to introduce his premise, his stated premise that stuntmen don't get laughs, which means his stated conclusion has to be, I never used a stuntman. Now, this is unlike the one we just did about revenge in a couple of ways. We've got 2 negations in the stated parts of the argument. That is, both the stated premise and the stated conclusion are negations. And also we don't have the same subject in the stated premise and in the conclusion. So let me show you a technique that we actually could have used for numbers 1 and 5. We didn't need to. But for this example, for number 6, is by far the best approach. First, I'm going to assume that this argument is valid, so my unstated premise, first I'm going to assume that this argument is deductive, so my unstated premise is going to have to make this valid. And what I am going to do is construct an unstated premise with an if-then structure. After if, we'll have the stated premise. After then, we'll have the conclusion. So 2 will say, if stuntmen don't get laughs, then I never used a stuntman. You might recognize this as one of the commonly used argument patterns that we studied in Chapter 1. Stuntmen don't get laughs corresponds to A. I never used a stuntman corresponds to B. So we've got A, if A then B, therefore B. And this is a valid argument pattern. Now, let's stick with the same argument, that is in terms of its stated parts, but consider it instead to be inductive. And we're only going to have to make one tiny little modification so that we end up with a strong rather than a valid argument. That is, add the word probably someplace after then in the unstated premise. When I say add it after then, it doesn't have to necessarily be immediately after the word then, but somewhere after then where it sounds good or makes sense. So how about this? If stuntmen don't get laughs, then I probably never used a stuntman. Now, if 1 and 2 are true, it would be possible for 3 to be false, so this is not valid. However, if 1 and 2 are true, it would be very unlikely for 3 to be false, so this is strong. Okay, I hope this has been helpful to you. I understand that unstated premises, adding unstated premises, can be one of the more difficult topics for students at times. So if you have any questions at all, please don't be shy about asking me. I'm happy to help you with this, as I am with anything else. Hope you're having a good day, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.